Chapter 10 Nothing Changes, Part 3. When the two of them broke the hug and got up, Luz had shoved her books into her bag this time. Andy's legs were so wobbly she nearly toppled back to the floor. Luz managed to stay her just in time, a worried look on her face as she gently slipped an arm around Andy's shoulders to help her stand. Hey, you okay? Andy closed her eyes for a moment and took a deep breath. Fine, but... She lowered her voice. I think that spell took a lot more out of me than it should have. Andy hadn't realized it until now, but she's feeling kind of dizzy and a little bit sick, in a way she hadn't since she'd been a little kid trying to cast spells way beyond her abilities. She hadn't thought about what being away from the bowling aisles would mean for her ability to use magic. Luz's seemed to work just fine after all, but this had Andy shaken. Still, she forced herself to keep her composure like she'd been taught to do since she was 5, stowing away the worries for later. The middle of a school hallway in a world that didn't know magic existed was hardly the right place to freak out about this. We have to get to class now anyway. You can sit down there and by the time we have to get back up, you'll hopefully feel a bit better. Luz kept supporting her all the way to class, which maybe wouldn't have been necessary, but Andy wasn't complaining. Thankfully, Andy really did feel a bit better after sitting down. Luz pulled a juice box from her backpack and handed it to her friend, who downed it gratefully. Andy's head cleared a bit after that, and she tried not to think too hard about how drained she felt after such a small spell. Class itself was kind of a disaster too. Andy was so used to always being top of her class, always prepared for any question that might be asked. Her hand raised more often than not. She worked herself to complete exhaustion back home, but that hard work paid off. Occasional approving nods from her parents for another exam with a perfect score. Her top student badge that she'd long since recovered after the Willow incident a couple months ago. The praise she got from her teachers. Those made Amity feel confident and good about herself. Without that, and without the powerful magical abilities she trained so hard to achieve, who even was she anymore? She tried listening to the teacher, tried skimming through the text of the history book, but they made no sense to her. Amity never struggled with her classes in the bowling aisles, not like this anyway. She could remember ever feeling this lost in school before, and it felt so awful she wanted to cry. For the first time in her life, Amity spent a class hoping the teacher wouldn't call on her. The first period ended, and despite Luz warning Amity that their school didn't have a screaming bell the day before, Amity didn't realize that class was actually over until half their classmates had already left the room. You coming? Amity quickly threw her stuff into her bag, really embarrassed about not realizing what was going on earlier. On it! Luz gently put a hand on her friend's shoulder and gave her a worried look. Everything okay? You don't look very good. It's nothing. Amity bit her lip. I'm just worried about the thing from earlier. There's no way that won't have some kind of repercussions. It wasn't even the thought of telling Luz how lost she felt that scared her. This was Luz after all, and Amity knew her crush would never have thought less of her for something like that. Especially since Luz knew firsthand how difficult getting used to a new environment and classes she'd never taken could be. No, what actually scared Amity was the thought of admitting to herself out loud that she wasn't good enough. The day hardly improved from there. Math was slightly less confusing than history, since the bowling aisles did have an equivalent to that, but it was still a lot more complex than anything Amity had ever learned. By the 30-minute mark, she was just about ready to smash her head into the nearest desk. To her great joy, math turned out to be a double period. Thankfully, they had English after that, something Amity actually enjoyed because she understood what the teacher was talking about. She even shyly raised her hand 3 times and actually got to give an answer that the teacher confirmed to be correct, which made her feel a little better. until Miss Wilson asked to speak to her after class, and her heart dropped into her gut. Great. The one class that doesn't turn my brain into complete mush and the teacher already hates me. It seemed the day had finally taken mercy on Amity, though. Miss Wilson wasn't upset with her at all. I know you missed the first couple days of school. I just wanted to say there's no pressure to make your work up right away. I'll accept the assignments at any point this week, Miss Wilson explained kindly before dismissing her with a friendly smile. Amity allowed herself a sigh of relief over not getting in trouble in the first class she actually liked. Then it was back to the confusing stuff. Physics, which, by the end of that lesson, Amity was convinced was actually a fancy human realm word for even more confusing math. And chemistry were both utter mysteries to her. And everything slowly started blending together in her head to make the whole mess complete. Amity's wonderful day culminated when the school secretary walked into their last class before lunch break to proclaim to all their classmates that they were in trouble. Amity Blight, Luz Noceda, please report to the principal's office immediately. As Luz and her exchanged nervous glances and packed their bags, Amity noticed there was another empty seat in the classroom, the one where Ben had been sitting. A few minutes later, the two girls were sitting in the room right outside the principal's office to wait. Ben apparently already inside, taking his time to tell the principal whatever sob story he'd come up with to land the girls in trouble. The only good thing about that was that they didn't have to face him for now. Amity wasn't sure she'd have the restraint to let him off easily a second time. Meanwhile, Luz had been informed that her mom had been called in for another chat with Principal Hall. Not even a week after school started, no less. Luz knew her mom wouldn't be thrilled about that. Camila would be there soon, and they weren't supposed to go in until she was. Both girls were extremely nervous. Amity was tense, fingers clenched around the arms of her chair as she faced the floor. The thought of getting in trouble made her feel sick to her stomach. Luz was fidgeting in her seat. This could only end in two ways. Luz and Amity getting in trouble for something Ben did, or a conversation with her mom that Luz had been avoiding for years. She forced that particular thought to the back of her mind, her hand finding Amity's on the armrest. Mom's not gonna be thrilled, but she's not gonna rip our heads off, okay? Amity took a deep breath, slightly embarrassed that Luz had realized how nervous she was. Was she getting worse at concealing her feelings? Had she never been as good at it as she thought? Was Luz just getting that good at reading her? That last thought was kind of sweet. So that was the explanation Amity stuck with. With Luz's hand in hers, she felt her nervousness subside a little. You know, I've only known you for less than 4 months, and this is already the second principal I get in trouble with, Amity stated, elbowing Luz with a conspiratorial grin. You're going to turn me into a troublemaker yet. Amity didn't regret what she'd done. Okay, maybe she regretted how she'd done it, at least a little, because Luz was probably right about that being too risky. But she was too incredibly nervous about getting called into the principal's office because of it. This was not the kind of impression Amity had wanted to make on her first day of school, and she had no clue how Camila would react, who had given nothing short of the world to Amity, had never been anything but kind to her, and for whom the girl had caused nothing but trouble since she'd gotten here. She hated the thought of disappointing Camila, and for maybe the first time in her life, that fear had nothing to do with Amity being afraid of the punishment. Well, at least no one almost got dissected this time, Luz said with a snort, causing Amity to break into laughter as well. And because timing had never been on Luz's side for as long as she could remember, of course, that was when her mother walked in. What was that about someone being dissected? Luz yelped and then plastered on the broadest, least convincing innocent grin Amity had ever seen. Hi, Mom! Willow had been standing outside the school for a bit now. She casually checked her watch again. When she looked up, Basha was standing next to her. You waiting for someone? Willow barely managed to keep herself from flinching violently, startled as she was by the other girl appearing out of nowhere. She made a mental note to add, "No sneaking up on me," to the agreement when the other girls were around to hear it. Then turned to face Basha and crossed her arms. Gus, he should have been here by now, but his class could have let out a bit late for any number of reasons, so she wasn't particularly worried. It was just unfortunate that him being late had led to a solo encounter with Basha. Not like that's any of your business. Well, since he's not here yet... Willow really didn't like the way the other girl was smirking at her. Can I talk to you for a sec? Just want to make some things clear from the very beginning. Basha stared her down, but once again, Willow fought down her fear and firmly stood her ground. She was contemplating just flat out telling the other girl no, but she decided on the slightly pettier option. Oh? Willow raised an eyebrow and smiled at Basha innocently. What is it that you have to tell me? Surely you don't want to break our agreement barely a day in, because cornering me like this does put you on thin ice. The schoolyard is a public place, lots of people around. That hardly counts as cornering. I'm not breaking anything, Basha grumbled. I just wanted to give you a piece of advice before you get your hopes up. If you think this is going to change anything between us in the long run, you'll be sorely disappointed, Willow. Basha quickly corrected herself before the cruel insult she'd used for years slipped out. As much as this arrangement annoyed her, she would have to make do with it for the time being. Still, it was important to draw certain lines before Willow got any ideas. After the cast comes off, you'll leave the team again, and that's it. This is a necessary evil. No more, no less. We're not going to be friends. Willow was filled with the absurd urge to laugh, completely baffled over what she'd just heard. She was no stranger to Basha's ridiculous sense of self-importance, but this had to be a new record for her. How unbelievably conceited could one person be? You really don't get it, do you? Willow hesitated for a moment. Was she really willing to do this and live with whatever consequences it led to? Well, what don't I get? Why don't you enlighten me? Willow clenched her fists at Basha's mocking tone and her smug grin. The decision practically made itself. You think of yourself as this untouchable being that's so much better than everyone. And everyone else is supposed to worship the ground you walk on. And why? Because your parents are rich? Because you're good at sports? She stared Basha directly in the eyes as she continued. Well, newsflash, Basha. You're not better than anyone. You're a lot worse than most of us, in fact. You never consider how much you make anyone else feel with the way you behave. You're a terrible person. You're always mean to everyone. You've been picking on me for years. Why the heck would I want to be friends with you? She couldn't imagine a reason why anyone would want that. The thought of trailing behind Basha, laughing on command to boost the bully's ego was enough to make Willow sick. That you think of that as some covetable achievement for someone you've been bullying for years really says a lot about how self-absorbed you are. She crossed her arms, shook her head, and then looked straight at Basha once more for the last thing she had to say. I do hope your arm gets better soon, though, because once it does, I can go back to seeing you as little as possible. Willow gave her former bully a bright, bold smile as she turned on her heel. Have a nice day, Basha! See you tomorrow! And just like that, she walked off, leaving behind a very baffled Basha who was too dazed to even manage a snarky comment in return. Willow felt like she was walking on air. This was quite possibly the most amazing feeling in the entire world. Gus appeared next to Willow a moment later, a worried expression on his face. He hadn't seen much, but Basha talking to Willow alone simply couldn't be a good thing. Are you okay? I'm sorry for being so late. Someone messed up a spell and illusions, and we had to stay longer until everyone looked like themselves again. If I'd gotten here earlier, I'm fine. Don't worry. Willow stopped him with a wave of her hand. Holy heck, I just did that, she whispered, a little in disbelief about how brave she'd just been, but also so incredibly proud of herself. Gus looked visibly relieved when he saw the huge smile on her face. What happened? Willow felt the most confident she had in months as she gave a quick summary of the encounter to Gus on their way to the owl house, and was maybe a bit too satisfied remembering how the other girl had gaped at her. Sorry, Basha. I'm done being scared of you, and there's nothing you can do about it. Maybe the next couple of weeks wouldn't be so bad after all. End of chapter.